Nobody could fix the billionaire's Ferrari, not the luxury dealerships, not the elite mechanics flown in from Europe, not even Ferrari's own specialists. The rare black hypercar sat motionless in the center of a massive private garage like a wounded animal nobody understood. Every polished surface around it reflected wealth beyond imagination. Exotic cars worth millions lined the walls under bright white lights, but the Ferrari received all the attention and all the frustration. For 6 months, the billionaire obsessed over repairing it. The car was one of only a few ever produced, custom-built, nearly impossible to replace. He bought it at a private auction for more money than most people would earn in several lifetimes. It barely ran. The engine started for seconds before shutting down completely, and every repair attempt failed. "I've already spent $2 million, the billionaire snapped one afternoon while pacing across the garage floor. "How is this still not fixed?" The lead mechanic looked exhausted. "Sir, we replaced the ignition system, fuel regulators, software controls, and half the engine components." The mechanic lowered his eyes carefully. "The issue keeps returning." Silence filled the garage. Around the Ferrari stood engineers, technicians, and specialists too afraid to admit the truth. They had no idea what was wrong. The billionaire clenched his jaw. "Then find someone who does." At the far side of the garage, a quiet woman continued mopping the marble floor while trying not to attract attention. She worked cleaning the estate during evening shifts and usually stayed invisible to the wealthy people surrounding her. Beside her stood her teenage son Marcus, waiting after school for her shift to end. Nobody paid attention to him, at least not at first. While the mechanics argued around the Ferrari, Marcus quietly watched the car with unusual focus. His eyes moved carefully across the rear engine section as if he noticed details everyone else missed. "Efreniers." The mechanic finally smirked at him. "You like cars, kid?" A few others laughed soft. Marcus nodded politely but stayed quiet. Another mechanic chuckled. "This thing costs more than your whole street." More laughter followed across the garage. Marcus ignored it. Instead, he took one small step closer toward the Ferrari. His mother immediately looked nervous. "Marcus," she whispered carefully. "Where's Marcus? First of all." The billionaire turned briefly toward the boy, clearly irritated by the interruption. But something unexpected caught his attention. Marcus wasn't looking at the car with excitement. He was studying it, like an engineer examining a problem. The billionaire narrowed his eyes slightly. "What are you staring at?" Marcus hesitated and pointed quietly toward the rear airflow vents near the engine compartment. "That sound," he said softly. Several mechanics exchanged confused looks. "What court more one will pour gerber were fropable?" Mechanics exchanged confused looks. "What sound?" one asked sarcastically. Marcus stepped slightly closer. "When the ignition cuts off, the airflow pressure shifts too late." The garage became strangely quiet. The lead mechanic frowned. "That doesn't even make sense." But Marcus continued calmly. "You replaced engine components because you thought the failure started inside the motor," he explained carefully. "But the engine's reacting to something else." The billionaire crossed his arms slowly now, watching him more seriously. "And what exactly would that be?" he asked. Marcus looked directly toward the Ferrari again. "The airflow calibration system," he answered quietly. "I think it's choking the fuel balance before ignition stabilizes." Complete silence. Nobody laughed anymore, because suddenly, even the mechanics realized something uncomfortable. The teenager standing beside them understood the car well enough to speak their language. And for the first time in months, the billionaire felt something he hadn't felt since the Ferrari broke down. The garage stayed completely silent after Marcus finished speaking. The mechanics looked at one another with disbelief written across their faces. Some seemed annoyed. Others looked genuinely confused. Because the teenager's explanation actually made sense. The billionaire slowly stepped closer. "How would you even know something like that?" Marcus hesitated briefly. "I study engine systems online," one mechanic scoffed immediately. "Online videos don't teach this level of engineering." Marcus stayed calm. "No, but rebuilding old engines does." The billionaire's eyes narrowed with curiosity now. "You rebuild engines?" Marcus nodded once. "Mostly junkyard cars." Few mechanics exchanged uncomfortable glances. The billionaire looked toward the lead technician. "Check the airflow calibration system." The mechanic hesitated. "Sir, we already ran diagnostics." "Humor me." The room immediately shifted into motion again. Technicians connected equipment while others removed panels near the rear engine housing. Marcus quietly stepped back beside his mother, who looked terrified by all the attention. "You shouldn't have said anything," she whispered nervously. Marcus lowered his voice. Minutes passed. Then suddenly, one mechanic froze while staring at the diagnostic screen. Another technician moved closer immediately. The mechanic looked stunned. "There's a delay spike in the airflow synchronization." The billionaire turned sharply. The lead mechanic grabbed the tablet and checked the readings himself. His face slowly lost color. Marcus was right. A tiny calibration failure buried deep inside the airflow control system had been disrupting the fuel balance every time the engine stabilized. The issue was nearly invisible during normal testing, because it only triggered under a very specific pressure sequence. One engineer muttered quietly, "How did we miss this?" Nobody answered. Because nobody understood how a teenage boy noticed something that experienced Ferrari specialists overlooked for months. The billionaire stared toward Marcus carefully now. "Can it be fixed?" he asked the mechanics. The lead technician swallowed hard. "Yes, actually, it can." The billionaire's attention returned to Marcus immediately. "You figured that out just by listening?" Marcus nodded carefully. The engine sound changed before shutdown. Silence again. Then, for the first time all day, the billionaire smiled slightly. "Interesting." The mechanics quickly began recalibrating the airflow system while tension spread through the garage. Nobody laughed at Marcus anymore. Now they kept glancing toward him with a mix of shock and embarrassment, especially the men who mocked him earlier. After nearly an hour of adjustments, the lead technician finally stepped away from the Ferrari. "Ready?" The billionaire folded his arms tightly. "Start it." One mechanic pressed the ignition button. The Ferrari roared to life instantly. Not for seconds, not briefly. The engine stabilized perfectly with a deep, powerful growl that echoed across the entire garage. Nobody moved. The sound continued smoothly without interruption. Several mechanics stared in complete disbelief. One engineer whispered, "That's impossible." The billionaire slowly walked toward the car while the engine purred flawlessly behind him. Then he turned toward Marcus. "How old are you?" 17. "And you diagnosed this by ear?" Marcus nodded quietly. "We quite boss sulfa wumper bra." Marcus nodded quietly. The billionaire looked at the expensive specialists surrounding him, then back toward the teenager beside the cleaning cart. A strange realization hit him hard. The smartest person in the garage wasn't wearing a suit, wasn't carrying engineering credentials, and wasn't the millionaire experts he hired. It was the maid's son standing quietly near the wall. The billionaire walked closer to Marcus slowly. "What do you want to do with your life?" he asked. Marcus looked down briefly before answering. "Mechanical engineering." The billionaire stared at him for several seconds, then smiled again. "Good," he said softly, "because starting tomorrow, you're coming back here." The Ferrari's engine continued roaring smoothly through the garage. First time in 6 months, the billionaire heard the sound he'd been chasing through endless repairs, expensive diagnostics, and failed promises from elite mechanics around the world. The 17-year-old boy fixed it in less than an hour. Nobody in the garage could fully process it. The mechanics stood silently beside millions of dollars worth of equipment, still staring at Marcus like they were trying to understand how someone they dismissed so quickly had solved the impossible problem. The billionaire slowly walked around the Ferrari, listening carefully to the flawless engine response. No interruptions, no shutdown. He turned back toward Marcus again. "What school do you go to?" he asked. Marcus mentioned a small public school across town. One mechanic looked genuinely stunned. "They teach advanced automotive systems?" Marcus shook his head. "No, I learned most of it myself." The billionaire raised an eyebrow slightly. "How?" Marcus glanced briefly toward his mother. "We couldn't afford much growing up." "Couldn't afford much," he admitted quietly. "So when cars broke down in our neighborhood, I started fixing them with borrowed parts." His mother smiled faintly, though emotion filled her eyes. "He rebuilt his first engine when he was 13, she said softly. Several mechanics looked embarrassed hearing that, because earlier they laughed at him. Now they realized the teenager beside them had developed extraordinary skill without expensive tools, private education, or professional training. Determination. The billionaire walked closer slowly. "Do you know how many experts looked at this Ferrari?" he asked. "And you still spoke up." Marcus hesitated before answering honestly. The car deserved better than guessing. Silence filled the garage again. That answer hit differently, because the billionaire suddenly realized Marcus wasn't trying to impress anyone. He genuinely cared about understanding the machine. That passion couldn't be taught. The lead mechanic stepped forward awkwardly. "Kid, I owe you an apology." Several others nodded quietly in agreement. Marcus looked surprised but remained polite. "It's all right," the mechanic admitted honestly. "It's not." The billionaire crossed his arms thoughtfully before speaking again. "How much does your mother earn working here?" The question caught everyone off guard. His mother looked uncomfortable immediately. "Sir, that's not necessary. Would it grow some more in all bought for one wall?" "Sir, that's not necessary. It is to me," he interrupted calmly. She quietly gave the number. The billionaire's expression hardened instantly. "That's all?" No one answered. Looked back toward Marcus. He looked back toward Marcus. "And you've been teaching yourself engineering while helping support your family?" Marcus nodded. The billionaire stared at the teenager silently for several seconds before finally making a decision. "Pack your things," he said. Marcus blinked in confusion. What? The billionaire smiled slightly. You're not wasting your talent fixing neighborhood cars anymore. The entire garage listened carefully now. I'm paying for your education, the billionaire continued. Best engineering school, full scholarship, whatever resources you need. Marcus froze completely. His mother covered her mouth in shock. The billionaire pointed toward the Ferrari behind him. You solved a problem that cost me millions, he said calmly. That tells me everything I need to know. Emotion filled the room instantly, not because of the money, because for the first time in his life, someone powerful finally saw Marcus for what he truly was. Not the maid's son, not a poor kid standing quietly in the corner. A genius. The billionaire walked toward the Ferrari one final time before looking back at Marcus with a small smile. No, he said, most people spend their whole lives trying to sound intelligent. He glanced toward the perfectly repaired engine. You didn't have to say much at all. And standing inside that luxury garage surrounded by million-dollar cars and humbled experts, Marcus realized something powerful. Talent doesn't care where you come from. Eventually, the world notices it anyway. Hope,